Thank you all for having me. Thank you for that nice introduction. It's great to be here, and I always enjoy getting the opportunity to talk to people about what makes organizations effective. As an administrator and as a dean, I get less and less chance to actually interact in the areas that I'm most passionate about from a research and teaching perspective. But in my previous life, and I try to maintain that some, as Judy mentioned, over the course of my career, I've had two real areas that drive my interests and passions. One of them is economic reform in China. So I spend a lot of time and have over the course of my career thinking about what makes organizations effective there and what multinational corporations can do effectively there. But the other is in the field of leadership, and really kind of thinking about what makes leadership work, what makes organizations effective, and how you can be an effective leader and foster or unleash creativity within organizations. And I spent a lot of time in my previous job as not only a teacher but an administrator for executive education in this area. And so it's nice to be back in a classroom kind of environment. In this particular setup, the way I've been told that it's been designed this time is that there is a response group, a panel. And so I'm going to kind of run through things, but I tend to like to do things interactively. And so there may be moments when I will ask questions of you, and it won't be just a rhetorical question, but I'll actually, if you sit silent, I'll cold call on you. And there may be times when you might have questions that you'd like to hear us go off in a different direction, and I'm completely fine with that, because my view is that these moments, these times that you take away from your busy schedules are not effective unless we actually make them effective for you. So therefore I want to spend time talking about the things that you guys are most interested in. Leadership is a funny term. It's kind of to the world today what strategy was in the 1980s. In the 1980s, strategy was kind of the obsession of the business school and of the business world. All the strategy professors were totally hot. You know, we saw the rise of Michael Porter. We saw all of the dynamics about how organizations can think strategically. For a leadership perspective, or a leadership professor, it was an interesting time because I often think about leadership this way, in that strategy is great. You can have a great product. You can even have a great strategic idea, but if you can't drive that strategy through an organization, it doesn't mean much. Right? And so I, at the very least, think these things should go together synergistically. But I always thought, well, it's great to talk about strategy, but it's a little bit premature to just think if you can teach people strategic thinking, then the organization is going to be off and running. Now today, we're kind of in a different environment on this. I think people get that a little bit more. They get the fact that you can't send people out with great financial instruments to build mortgage-backed securities and expect that if you're not managing your organizational structure and risk profile, that bad things aren't going to happen. Right? And so we're in a little bit of a different time and a different space, and so leadership is kind of hot. People think about organizational behavior. They think about the psychology of organizations. And so there's, thousands and thousands of books that have been written in the last decade on leadership. And so everybody kind of has an opinion, particularly people who are in responsibility-bearing positions in organizations. So I kind of like to start with what people think of leadership. What do you think leadership is? When I say the term leadership, it has a certain meaning. Glenn, what do you think leadership is?
So it's fun enough to define a word using a word. It's hard to do that. But to show the direction of an organization by example.
Okay, show the direction of an organization by example. So the leader has to be as much kind of held to task for doing what you expect your people to do. Okay? So it's a good definition. Yes, sir?
I would say, in some ways, inspiring others to see your vision and to pursue it.
Inspiration and vision. These are two big topics you'll hear in leadership a lot. And both are very important, of course. Being able to actually motivate and inspire people is a crucial thing, but matching that with a strategic vision, of course, also important. God, what do you think?
not just defining where you need to get to, but also delegating the responsibility, coordinating and organizing the people under you to get
Okay, so it's not just about vision, and it's not just about inspiration, but that inspiration has to translate into some delegation, some kind of empowerment, perhaps. Kathy, what do you think?
I think really important to actually live and practice the mission, vision, organization.
So a little bit like what Glenn was saying, you have to actually live what you're expecting other people to live. So you put that vision together with what your expectations of people are, and then you actually have to carry it out. Betsy, what about you? Inspire. You go. So the inspiring route is an important one. Any others?
I think the leader also should be really good listening to some of the issues.
Listening. That's actually a really difficult one for leaders, unfortunately. Seems like it should be obvious, but it's actually the case that as people go throughout their careers and learn to trust their own instincts, we get worse and worse at listening. It's kind of an amazing thing, right? Just as we get to points in organizations where we need to be better and better at it, we get worse and worse at it. It's a good point. Yes, ma'am.
I think the leader also has to have the ability to know and execute plans and hold people accountable.
Okay, and that's a tough one, right? So you can do the empowerment part, but actually then doing the hard part of holding people accountable, you know, empowering feels like it's kind of a good cop dynamic, right? You feel like you give people the strength, the importance, the sense of self. Then you actually have to really be tough and hold people accountable for things. It's a hard dynamic to balance. Now what I'm going to do over the course of the next whatever amount of time I have is I'm going to kind of divide this up into two parts. The first is I want to talk to you about 6 myths that I think capture what leadership is about. If you ask people what leadership is about, and if you talk about it from the context that the literature really engages, you'll see a couple of key concepts that continue to come up. Now, each of these are, of course, important in leadership in their own right, but I like to think about leadership from a little bit of a different perspective than these. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time debunking some myths, and this is not to say that none of these are important for leadership, but it is to say that leadership is about something different and something much more than this. And then we're going to spend the second half of my time talking about a framework to think about leadership. I hope that framework is useful for you. I like to think in terms of tools. Now, normally when I teach a course on leadership, this kind of stretches over 10 weeks or at least several days, and so I don't know that we can actually deliver the tools right now, but I'd like to give you a framework for thinking about these ideas. Okay? And then we're gonna hear from the panel, and we'll have some interaction around the discussion. First thing on leadership, just to start off, my favorite quote, which I'm sure many of you know, it was actually made famous by Bobby Kennedy. It was really, the quote came from George Bernard Shaw and was borrowed by Bobby Kennedy. But it's kind of a beautiful thing just to talk about leadership in terms of dreams and action, right? But that's really not what the heart of leadership is. That's a very nice concept, and it's wonderful to kind of frame that around somebody who's very charismatic. But that's one of the first things that I like to pull people back from when we talk about leadership. It's so often the case that I interact with people, whether they're at a junior level or senior level in organizations, in which there's some sense about how there are these gifts of leadership. Right? You're born with charisma, and therefore you're a good leader. You're a great orator. Right? And we've seen those currently in our political system, but also historically in social movements that have changed America. That's not really what the heart of leadership is. It's wonderful and it's beautiful when you see it, but it's one small piece of what it is. So I want to talk today about how we define it, how we think about it, what the structure of it is. And so I want to talk about a couple of myths first, as I mentioned. The first myth, it's all about the individual. Right? And we see this both at the senior level, people who are in leadership positions, but also at the cultivation level. So often it frustrates me to no end when I hear people talking about how to build a great creative organization, and they so much focus on the idea that if we can just hire the most talented people, we'll be fine. Right? It's all about the talent. But what that misses, and this is really where this conversation is going to go, is that organizations are very complex social and political systems. And if you hire a talented bunch of individuals but don't have the right organizational structure in place to support the cultivation of talent and creative ideas, it doesn't mean anything. It's the same thing with this strategy leadership dynamic, right? You can have a great strategy, but if you don't have an organizational structure that supports that strategy, it doesn't mean anything, right? And so the first notion of leadership that I just want you to get away from is that it's about individuals, whether we're talking about you as leaders or the talent that you're trying to cultivate. Of course, it's great to have the smartest people in the room, but it's as important to have the right organizational structure designed around it. So forget about the individual, right? That's not where the action lies. The second myth, you often hear this. People say when I kind of go through these exercises, what is leadership? People kind of have this sense, well, you know you're a leader when people are following you, right? And there are some very famous people in industry and in political systems that have made a lot of statements about that. Would basically say, well, what it has to do with primarily is if you will know that you're an effective leader when you have inspired and energized a group of people to do whatever you want them to do. And there's something important about that, right? I'm not discounting the inspiration piece that has come up in a couple of your comments in the lead up to this. But again, it's one very small piece of the puzzle, and it often leaves out organizational structure. And you could also be leading people and realize that you're about to lead a group of lemmings over a cliff, right? And so there's got to be something more than we think about this. One that often comes up recently as well, and it's been particular fodder in the last decade, and Rudy Giuliani has kind of been the personification of this, is, well, at the very least, what you want in your leaders is people who know how to be calm in a crisis, people who know how to handle crises, people who know how to actually make people feel secure around them. Which is, again, that's fine, that's interesting. It's always a little odd to me when we think about leadership from that perspective, because basically what you're saying, if you're a board or a population in the government, you're saying, we want a person who's going to be able to lead us through the one thing that we hope doesn't happen. And there's a very small chance that it will. And instead, we don't focus on all of these other things that will make the person effective in the day-to-day basis, right? And so I think it's a little bit of an odd determination of what it is. The similar kind has to do with this inspiration piece which came up. I think inspiration is incredibly important, don't get me wrong. But inspiration has to be only a small piece of the puzzle because, again, it goes in this direction of leadership really being about the individual and about the individual psychological structure of the people that you're engaging with. Right? So what we need to think much more broadly about is how we build the organizational structure around people to make them effective. This is a big one. It's about the bottom line. Right? Leadership ultimately can be assessed and codified in the extent to which someone delivers. And in the capitalist economy, there's no better way to understand delivery than returns to shareholder value, right? John, you disagree?
Well, it sort of implies that the market is rational.
Ah, well that's a provocative statement. What do you mean by that? The market's not rational?
Harsher.
Okay.
I would say the market is equally emotional as rational.
All right, and I would say that about organizations as well, right? And that's one of the things. We live in an era today in which we ourselves, this country, has been a group of lemmings. And the leader of those lemmings have been the field of neoclassical economic theory. Right? We have bought hook, line, and sinker since the 1970s the idea that humans are homo economicus, we are rational, profit-maximizing individuals, and you don't need to know much. Markets and capitalism are pretty simple systems. All you need to know is that if you get the incentives right, your organization will be effective. And in fact, this wasn't the first time we went through this. Right? This country and some of Europe went through a system called Taylorism that was based on a pamphlet, then book, that was written in 1908 and 1911. It was called Scientific Management. Right? The idea was that people are very rational. You can set up systems with stopwatches and, train people to actually, clock in and clock out to the second when they need bathroom breaks and such. The irony then was that it actually led to the unionization movement. So there was really big corporations at that stage. But in the 70s, we really followed this model of buying into this notion of shareholder value. One interesting thing about Jack Welch. So forget about the debate or the question about whether or not markets are rational, but let's just talk about rational assessments. Right? Jack Welch, of course, if you want to talk about shareholder value and returns to shareholder value, can't argue, right? Over 1,000% increase over the course of a 20-year period as CEO. But if you assess him on return on assets, the worst CEO GE ever had. Right? Bottom of the heap. Now, there's an interesting reason for that, and he wouldn't survive in today's economy because you're not allowed to do earnings smoothings the way they did under Welch's regime, right? Sarbanes-Oxley changed that. So there's even something that's sketchy about the delivery in terms of shareholder value. But the important thing is to understand that this is a very small part of what makes organizations effective in the long run. Right? Now, of course, today there's another person who's replaced him as the rock star of industry. Who's that? Steve Jobs, of course, right? He's, of course, one of the... And Steve Jobs adds not only the greatest return of shareholder value for a CEO, and he was just made the number one CEO of the first decade of the new millennium by Fortune magazine, but he brings creativity to the system, right? What an amazing individual. Now, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later because there's something very interesting that most people don't know or remember about him. Does anyone remember Steve Jobs from 1984? Not only got fired, but if he wouldn't have gotten fired, we would not be talking about Apple Computer today. That was a toxic organization that he himself was destroying because of poor leadership. Right? Now, he actually did transform as an individual and came back in a very different state of mind in 1996, but it tells you something about what leadership is, right? Leadership is not just great creativity, product management, sales pitching, vision. It's also about how you build an organization effectively, and when you don't do that, your organization will meet its demise. So I'll come back to this example and give you a little more kind of grist for talking about it, but I think it's an interesting one to talk about, okay? The final myth, and this is not just probably a myth for you, because I think you all are probably more senior in your organizations and your careers, but it's one that I like to talk with people like you about, but also talk with more junior people in organizations about, which is that we tend to wait for leadership to happen to us. We tend to wait for leadership to be anointed with a position, right? I'm not a leader today because I'm a manager. And actually, this way of thinking comes from the literature itself. In 1979, a very famous article was written in Harvard Business Review that was called Leaders and Managers, How Are They Different? And it basically introduced this notion of the psychology of the leader. There's a group of people who grow up in their lives and have the talents, the charisma, the vision of leadership. And then there are those that are executors, right? And leave the execution to them. There are two problems with that, in my opinion. The first problem is it gets leaders off the hook of understanding the complexity of their own organizations. And by the way, that is the worst thing you can do from a leadership perspective. Nobody who is the head of an organization, and I have learned this very deeply myself over the course of the last year as the dean of the school, you're not off the hook for understanding details and for execution. Right? You need to know everything. That's what being a leader is really about. But we have this notion that, well, leaders provide the vision and the charisma. Like, let the managers do their execution piece. So the first problem is the one that it seems to let leaders off the hook of knowing the details of how their organizations are run. But the second problem is that what it means is that the people who are at lower levels of organizations don't understand that leadership happens at every level of the organization. Leadership does not happen only at the top. This is, to me, the most profound thing to talk about leadership. If you can create an organization in which every person, from the lowest level entry assistant to the highest level person reporting up to the CEO of the organization thinks like a leader, your organization will win. Right? Conversely, if you have an organization in which everybody looks to that person at the top, the CEO or the head of a division, and it's a very hierarchical structure with no kind of empowerment in it, your organization will not win in today's economy. It's not going to happen. Right? And so I'd like to think of this as reclaiming leadership from the top. Leadership is not about the position that you're in. It is about the way in which you approach your job every day. And it's about the way that you teach people in the organization to approach their job every day. And so if there's one thing that I want you to take away from this today, this conversation, this is the most important nugget. How you capture this idea of creating leaders throughout your organization is, to me, the most exciting space to be playing in the field of leadership. Okay. So those are my 6 myths. So this is kind of the end of part 1 of what I want to talk about. And I'm going to just kind of give you a summary in case you want to not off and go to sleep for the next part. That's at least get something out of this. And so here are the key takeaways. Now, I didn't frame all these this way, although a couple of them are in here. Okay? The first position, it's not about the position that you are in, it's about how you act in that position. This is, again, the thing of stealing leadership away from the top. Right? Leadership is about how you pick up the phone and interact with the client. It's how you manage laterally. It's what your bedside manner is about. It's about how you think about the complexities that feel like you should be above them because you're in a bigger position than this organization. All of those things are leadership, and about how you teach people at junior positions within organizations to act that way is crucial. Okay. It's about everyday action and introspection. So here again, leadership, it's not just about the crisis moment and waiting for that crisis moment to know whether or not you have what it takes to be a leader. It's about this. It's about when you're dreading a conversation with a colleague, but then you realize, I actually need to go have that conversation because that's the right thing to do from a leadership perspective. And we may forget this tomorrow because we'll be enmeshed in another set of conversation, but I need to do this right now. Right? But it's also about knowing yourself, and that's what the introspection piece is, and I'll come back to that. I'm also going to come back to this set of issues, but this has to do with the vision versus execution piece. It is about organizational interests. You have to design an effective organization if you're going to be a good leader. Empowerment. I love the concept of empowerment. For people who have been very capable and risen to the top of organizations, it's very hard to give up power. I was actually just in a fascinating conversation with somebody about this last week. Somebody that works with the New York City government, and she was saying, no, I love the stuff you talk about in terms of empowerment. I love it. It's just that the problem is when I give those assignments to people, I need to know that they're going to get done well. And then I said, so you're like looking over their shoulder and you're going to step in at the last moment, right? She was like, yeah, but I'm really just looking from a distance. And I was like, you haven't empowered anyway. Right? Like you have not trusted that people are going to deliver for you, and therefore you're not actually creating the culture of the organization that you're trying to. The world we live in today is very, very complex. It's not just complex in terms of the environment and how it's changing, but it's also complex in terms of individual level psychology. This is something that has always been true. And so leadership, I think, is about understanding and embracing that complexity. The final thing, which I didn't actually know that well before this year, I've only been a dean of a business school for 1 year. It's sort of a funny thing when you teach leadership, particularly at the executive levels in business schools. Yeah, you kind of develop a shtick and you kind of get known for a certain set of ideas, but in the end you've like never led an organization. So it's a little embarrassing, and so over the last year, all of these things that I've been talking about have been put to the test because I run an organization of 256 people. It's got a pretty significant flow of revenues and profits and complex dynamics within the university that we're embedded in, and so I have to make things happen. And the thing that I've added to my list that was never there before is you have to be willing to sit with people, make the hard decisions, but have the empathy to listen and care. And so that's sort of a new addition to my list of these. Now, this is part 2. I think I have about 20 more minutes to talk about this, so I want to give you some sense of the toolbox or the framework that I like to think about this in. And this comes out of years of executive education and consulting with organizations. Because I actually think that this is something that is very effective as a framework for thinking about how organizations are structured and designed. It's a very simple framework, but it's one that I think every leader should be engaged with. And again, this is not something that's to be passed out to managers. You have to all think about this. So the key thing when I think about what makes an effective leader is that we need to think beyond these individual level aspects of charisma and kind of interpersonal skills and think more deeply about how to design effective organizations. So that's really always been my hobby horse. I mean, if you think of the field of leadership, the vast majority of us are over here on the individual psychological perspective. And then there's a small group of us who are actually much more about like, yeah, that stuff's important, except what we need to do is think about organizational structure and design. And so it's more of a macro level perspective on this. And that's really what I like to emphasize. I like to emphasize 4 key ways of organizing what you're doing. I kind of think of them as concentric circles, or kind of a hierarchically organized thing. If you think about the vision of the organization, it is the broadest level of what we do. We all, as leaders, need to understand the strategy and the vision of how you're going to get from point A to point B. And then there's a second level that goes one step deeper, which is the structure of the organization, the alignment of that organization with the vision, but also the internal alignment of the structure itself. And there's an interesting and important piece here that has to do with organizational culture. The third level of this is interpersonal. It has to do with how your workers decide that they want to get up every morning and not hit snooze, but instead come to work for you in an environment that's demanding more work for less pay. And there are lots of ways to think about that, but it's an important one. And the final is this issue of yourself. Do you know who you are? Do you have a good sense? I'm going to focus probably a little bit more time on this particular area, but we're going to run through each of these and then we'll leave some time to talk. Vision. This everybody knows. Everybody talks about this as being an important part of leadership, and of course it's important. You've got to understand how to look at the changing and dynamic environment and see where you're going to go. Vision, though, has embedded within it not just some grandiose ideas about where your organization is going to go, but a strategic approach to how to get there. It amazes me to no end when I'm invited in to do executive level, C-suite level offsites for major corporations. And sometimes I like to just start these things and say, it's just everybody get out a sheet of paper. I want to know the strategy of your company. Write it down. Right? You get 30 people in a room like you. They're all either C-suite, CFO and above, or maybe they're a part of the board. You know what happens? Turns out nobody knows what strategy is as a general concept, and nobody knows what their company strategy is. Now, how can it be that the top people, you should ask yourself this question, because you're all from different organizations, right? Do you know what your organization's strategy is? And does everybody who works with you at a similar level know what your organization's strategy is? I predict one of 2 things will happen. Either A, you'll get 30 different responses, or B, you'll get platitudes that don't mean anything, right? We want to be the greatest hospital in the world. We want to deliver the best service. We want to be the biggest bank in the world. We want to, these don't mean anything, right? Strategy is about how you deploy the resources that are available to you to create a competitive advantage in the marketplace. So do you have a view of how that vision relates to that strategy? And you must. You must. If your organization is going to be successful, that vision needs to encapsulate those ideas. Right? And if you don't think that the 30 people that work with you at senior levels of your organization do, you better get together. Talk about it. Right? So vision is, of course, important, but it's only the first level of this. The second level is how you drive that vision through the organization. And I like to think about this in a term that doesn't originate with me, but we like to call alignment, right, or congruency. Is the organization set up to match what that vision and strategy is? And so often you will find misalignments, right? And here again, this is where it comes down to this very simple concept. I don't think this is rocket science, but I can tell you how many organizations I've been in which the vision has nothing to do with what the organization is. One organization I was working with a couple of years ago was a small insurance company called AIG. I was doing an executive level offsite for them, and we were kind of designing an entire executive education curriculum. And this was when Martin Sullivan was the CEO. And I said, well, look, I hear what you're saying in terms of what your strategy is, but I need to talk to people in the organization. So I need to know how well aligned it is, what the culture is. If what you're telling me is true, like there's some missteps, there's some messiness. And the CFO says to me, oh, you know what, you don't need to talk to anybody. Actually, it's really fine. We've got this great thing. Martin Sullivan just made this DVD about like what the culture is. He told us what the vision is and what the culture is. And so like, we're fine, just watch the DVD. And of course, they sent this DVD to, I don't know, 1,000 people in the organization, and they all rolled their eyes and laughed. This is not leadership, right? Leadership is actually about understanding the connection between what that vision you have is, what the strategy is that you've articulated is, and then how the organization is structured and designed. You do not want your people throughout the organization rolling their eyes saying, those people in New York have no idea what it is that really goes on in this organization, or whatever that kind of dynamic is. So I like to think about this in a very basic framework. Okay? And so we passed out slides, so you have this to take away with you. I'm not going to spend too much time running through it. But basically, organizations end up being effective to the extent that there's congruency between the environment, the vision and strategy that is put in place to create competitive advantage in that marketplace, and then the formal structure of the organization, the people, the tasks, and the culture that emerges from that. And leadership is about that entire system. It's a system dynamics problem. Okay? So just let me give you a couple of examples here, because one of the things that I think is so important, to go back to the AIG example, and so many organizations suffer in this way. People think that culture of organizations is about words. We think that missions are about words. How many organizations have a mission statement that, says good things? Probably most of them, right? That's what you do when you define a mission statement. You're not going to say, like, well, we want to, exploit resources and exploit people and hurt the world, right? You don't say that.
We just looked at words. The end it says increase shareholder, but we want to save people, say like, oh, we want to increase shareholder.
So maybe a few still live in the 80s, which actually has an interesting ancillary issue for the U.S. economy. The SEC used to not let corporations say anything that didn't put most prominently putting shareholder value first, which that tells you something about the U.S. capital system, but that's another issue. But it is an interesting question. What does it mean that all 90%, 99% of organizations have a flowery mission statement, but they're not living that within their organizations? Well, part of the problem, I wouldn't say it's nefarious leadership. I would say that part of the problem is that leaders don't get how intimately intertwined structure and culture are. Your culture lives within your structure, right? And you have to make the hard decisions to analytically understand the interactions of those dynamics, but then also change the structures that will re-incentivize people to act in a different way. So I want to give you a couple of examples of that. I tried to find 2 examples in the healthcare sector, but I just don't know this sector well enough. So you guys can do the translation for me. I'll stick with what I know. 2 banks. One of them no longer exists. The other is making more money than ever. Right? Now, it's a very interesting thing about these banks because both of them were going gangbusters before 2008 financial crisis. But if you talk to people in these banks, it's very rare actually that you'll find people who have worked for both of these banks. Typically doesn't happen. I actually happen to have a friend who's on my board. We went to college together, and he was one of the few people that we have been able to find who worked for both of these banks. But generally you will not find it, because the cultures of these banks are so different. They're completely different kinds of places. These are not kind of platitudes or stereotypical things. If you interviewed 100 or 200 or 1,000 people, I don't know, very few, but many people from Bear Stearns and many people from Goldman, you would find these types of distinctions. You would find individualistic, entrepreneurial, aggressive, to define Bear Stearns. You would find one firm, one culture, one dynamic, group-oriented, risk-averse, to define Goldman, right? Now, one of the odd things is when you ask people, why did Bear fail and Goldman make money in the financial crisis? People would say, wow, those Goldman guys, they're pretty smart. Right? Which is an interesting thing, again, because it takes you to the individual, right? It just means that they're hiring the most talented people. But that's absolutely not true. There are just as many smart people that work for Bear Stearns. But the structure of the organization was so different in terms of its incentive systems, in terms of how they trained people at junior levels. And most interestingly, there's a great book that recently was written called Bullish on Wall Street that I reviewed for one of the academic journals recently. And it was so obvious that at least one of the banks that the person was talking about was Goldman Sachs, even though it was written as a study that was supposed to kind of hide that. But it's a brilliant book, actually, because what it lays out is that Bear Stearns, for example, the Bear Stearns is not profiled in the book, but I know Bear Stearns very well from an organizational perspective. Bear Stearns follows an organizational dynamic that is the instinct of all of the field of organizations, which is you create expertise. Right? That's what you do. That's how you get good, is you hire people who are smart, you let them specialize. It goes back to Adam Smith and the division of labor. You let them specialize, and then that specialization will create, a franchise within your organization. You make money off of it, right? And you have the best person working in the best field in the best way. Right? The problem with that is it creates silos of knowledge within organizations. And this is something that translates into all organizations across industries and fields, right? And when you do that, you're in a very risky position in a number of levels. One level is that what happens if that person leaves, right? I'm sure for those of you who work in healthcare, you know this problem, right? If you have a person who's the most talented in their field and they've created a franchise within the organization, what happens if they leave? Well, that would be bad for the organization. So that gives them a tremendous amount of power over the organization. John?
Contrast that to standard work as you go through this discussion.
To standard work?
Yeah, in other words, the Japanese lean idea of standard work in contrast to the individual expert.
Yes, so that's exactly the point, which is that there are places around the world, and Japan did this very well, in which you create a sort of one firm mentality in which people don't necessarily think about, they think about combining or contributing to the whole, but they don't necessarily think about their individual franchise within the whole. Right? Now, in a healthy capitalist economy, you still have to balance how to do rewards. And so the way that Goldman has done it is Goldman hires talented people, but they create uncertainty for their people. They basically move people around so much in their early careers and put them on jobs that they may fail on, that the instinct of all of these people, as they're treading water, is to constantly reach out and get feedback from senior people in the organization. And what that does is it creates an embedded practice and ultimately a culture of the organization that is it's not risk-averse the way people describe it. It's actually just very much engaged with sharing of information. Right? And so it's a completely different topic, or a completely different approach that is much more like the Japanese model. And so what happens in these things, my main point that I just want to get through is that structure and culture are intimately defined. And so if you live in an organization right now in which, if you did a poll of the people that work for you or around you and they said, yeah, this place is pretty toxic, the issue doesn't really come down to leadership per se. It comes down to the extent to which the leadership is defining the structures that build a healthy culture. Right? And that's a very hard thing. It's very complex. We pay billions of dollars a year to consulting firms to help us figure out how to do it. I don't know if that's necessarily money well spent, because I actually think it's the responsibility of leadership to figure these things out. Motivation is really an important part of anything. It's the person-to-person way that we think about these things. I'm just speeding up because I want to make sure that I leave enough time for things. Introspection. This is, if you remember my framework, the VAMI framework, vision, alignment, motivation, introspection. This is one that I find most puzzling from a leadership perspective. It is too often the case. And maybe it's not that puzzling because maybe it's just that to become a leader of a powerful organization, you've got to have a certain level of belief in yourself and belief in what you know and, courage and guts and whatever else it is. But somehow over time, over the course of a career, you end up being a person who's much better at convincing yourself of who you are than of looking in the mirror and admitting who you are. My best example of this that I've come across over the course of my career is my previous university. I didn't work that closely with, but I was kind of rising at administrative levels in the business school, and I worked for a university president, a guy named John Sexton, who was a brilliant fundraiser, amazing, charismatic, could tell great stories, could work a room and then stand up there and kind of know exactly how to pick out the right people. Really somebody to watch. She was the most unintrospective person I've ever met in my life. He was one of these people who would come into a meeting and say, what makes me a great leader is I'm a great listener. And then he would talk for 57 minutes out of 60 and say, but this meeting's really about you. What did you have to say? And then he would interrupt you 3 times in that last 3 minutes to tell you about something that related. And so, whatever. If his skills are to be a talker, that's fine. But, the disconnect that happens to people when they say, I'm a great listener and I'm here for you, that just sets everybody off in a bad direction, right? It just makes it less inspiring for the people who work for you. And so I just think the main thing about leadership is you need to be able to look in the mirror and say, who am I? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? There's nothing wrong with admitting your weaknesses. And build a team around you that works, right? Build a team around you that makes it so that those things are okay. I'm going to kind of skip through some of this stuff a little quickly. You have the slides, but I just want to go through because there are a couple of things that I want to get to, and then I want to get to the panel. I promise to come back to the Steve Jobs thing. It's actually a really interesting thing if you look into this guy's fascinating. If you care about leadership, you should read everything you can about him, because I actually think his early career and how he almost destroyed Apple Computer and then was sent off and kind of was out in the wilderness, and then he came back a very different kind of leader. Probably still a little bit of the micromanaging and kind of crazy person that he was before, and the organization was bigger and healthier, more robust and able to handle his personality. But he was also somebody who I think was probably better able to understand what his strengths and weaknesses are, and he exploited himself as the pitchman, and then built a strong team around him that was more effective. But to go back to that period of 1984, the one thing that people often forget about him is that he was in 2 positions in that organization. He was chairman of the board, and he was the boss of his boss, right? So his boss was John Scully, and he was his boss. And so it was just a completely, when you kind of break this down and think, what's dysfunctional about this organization? Why is this organization dying a slow or fast death from a cultural perspective in terms of what is the toxicity of its organizational culture? It's quite clear. The organizations like this can't work. And so I like to use this example because what I would contend to you is anytime you're in a situation in which you want to understand what's going wrong with your organization, you can usually break it down. You can find the structural problems. They're usually very obvious and they're there. And then the question is, do you have the personal power within your organization or the political power at a macro level to be able to change them? Sometimes that's hard. It was pretty clear what was wrong with GM and Ford. But it was also clear that the unions were very powerful and it was a difficult thing to change. So I'm not saying that this kind of change is easy. But it is clear, usually, what you have to do. There's, of course, another great organization in terms of culture that people always talk about because of its innovativeness. The interesting thing about Google that I'd love to really point out to people is that innovativeness as a culture is built deeply into the structure of the organization. This organization has everything that you think that we admire about Google is built into the incentive systems. It's built into the way in which the company is organized. And it is, there's just no other way to understand it. And so I would contend to you that if you want to build an effective organization, the heart of leadership is about really figuring out the complexity of how to design that organization effectively. Okay? Now, there's a couple of key things that I just want to go back to that are the kind of other tenets of leadership that don't get talked about enough. The first is courage. So this is beyond the vision, alignment, motivation, introspection piece, and then there are a couple of other pieces out there. Courage to make the right decisions. If you're in a complex organizational environment as the global economy is today, or as the field of healthcare is today. I mean, healthcare is a fascinating field to me. It's what is it, a $3.4 trillion industry if you include everything? That's about a third of the GDP, or maybe about 28% or something. That's an amazing number in terms of what it actually contributes to the growth of the economy. But it's also an incredibly messy one today. As I've done enough executive things with doctors and hospitals and HMOs to know that the system is struggling. The system is struggling to actually figure out what works for the amount of time invested by people in major professional positions, for what the ROI is. It's struggling because some of the people who are the best professionals in the organization don't have the business skills or often get passed over for not having the business skills to run the organizations. There's all kinds of interesting things here. But how you navigate your way through that complexity is fascinating to me. By the way, I'm in an industry that is in the same type of precipice. University education, there's going to be a major shakeup that happens over the next 10 years, 20 years. And I spend all my time rattling the cage of my faculty saying, don't you guys get it? Like, there's something that's going to happen that if we're not at the forefront of it, if we don't understand this environment and then have the courage to make the hard decisions, we're not going to win. Right? One of my favorite companies in this area, I do a lot of work in China, as I mentioned, and I just love Intel's courage. This is a company that, again, we think of as a very technical company. We think of it as its proficiency is embedded in the technology, but actually it's one of the most courageous organizations I've ever seen. And so I think their China policies are all about that, which I can talk about later.
What would those make the courageous?
There are two, one general, one specific that I can tell you. So they have the guts to, we kind of think about them as having a product that they just, in a technical proficiency they makes them a market leader and allow them to have 100 quarters of profits until, one hiccup about a year ago. But that's not what makes them great. What makes them great and what makes these companies great is they have the courage to constantly be looking at both the technological environment but also the global environment and constantly be making risky moves based on that. And that then builds a culture into it that kind of changes the people. So the China examples is a great one. They were doing wonderfully with their headquarters in Shanghai. They were like the dominant company in Shanghai, in the place in the world where everybody believes is the future of the global economy. And about 3 years ago, they decided, you know what, the future, it can't hold like this. Let's do an analysis of where this is going. And they basically picked up stakes and took a very risky move to move their headquarters out to Chengdu, which is the middle of nowhere. How many have been to Chengdu? See? Nobody knows where Chengdu is. Nobody knows what's going on in Chengdu. But if you understand the Western development process in China, if you understand getting more deeply embedded in the global economy, if you understand changing production cycles, and if you understand the global production cycle, which they now operate on, it was brilliant. It was a brilliant movement. But they have had the will to actually build that creativeness and that courageousness into everything that they do.
I realize that just because healthcare organizations tend to be somewhat risk averse,
Right.
and making those changes and talking about transformative time, looking to future and ability to even consider making those changes in business.
Yeah, and how to build that courage into the organization is, I think, a fascinating thing. I've mentioned complexity. I love this concept. It actually, I think, is very important for the U.S. economy because we've built our entire interface with the field of economics on simplification, not complexity. There's a kind of funny double-edged sword there. No economist would admit that they're about simplifying because the complexity of the mathematical models are very, robust. But the entire system of building those theoretical mathematical models is based on assumptions that John mentioned early in the discussion, right? They're not assumptions that actually matter for the world, right? They allow for elegant math, but do they actually tell you about human psychology or about the irrationality of markets? And then we're left wondering why it happens that there's $14 trillion of market capitalization lost in a 6-month period. And the reason is because we've taken shortcuts. We've gone the easy route. I would contend that understanding complexity is an advantage. There are huge opportunities out there if you embrace it. And actually, I won't talk about this now, but it's actually why I think China is winning the game of global capitalism, which is interesting in its own right. Failure. People fear failure. People fear there are people failing in organizations. Failure is the greatest opportunity out there. If you are building an organization, I put this guy up here because he's a senior executive at Dentsu, and I was having a conversation with him in probably 2006. And he was saying, yeah, before we went public, we had this great process, this great practice in our organization where we put junior people on accounts where we knew they were going to fail. Excuse me, would you say that again? Like, why would you want them to fail? And he would say, well, we have these deep relationships with clients, and sometimes we can afford it as long as the clients know what we're doing. And the issue is that we want people who understand that if they're put in a position to fail, what we're watching is how they stretch. Right? What we're watching is how they reach out to senior level leadership and ask questions. What we're watching is how they actually engage in the process of failing. And then they learn that they weren't chastised for failing, they were rewarded because of the way in which they engaged in that kind of work. That's very, very interesting. It changes the dynamic of the organization. He told me they had to stop that practice when they went public, which was very interesting because I think it tells you something about how capital markets actually change your engagement and risk. The best book on leadership, which is actually not a book on leadership, but it's one of the best books I've read in recent years, is by a great young writer named Catherine Schultz, and it's called Being Wrong. I think it's one of the best, and she actually kind of makes this point about failure, but she makes it kind of more in her framework about being wrong. Brilliant book, and brilliant about leadership, because I think you actually really need to think deeply about the kind of culture you build in your organization. And it is all too often the case that people fear being wrong, especially leaders. And probably the best words you can learn as a leader are, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Those will get you so much latitude and grace in your organization. And we just don't think about those issues enough. I'll end right here before we go into the panel with this is my other favorite leader who's become a good personal friend over the years, a guy named Keith Reinhardt, who's a true rock star of the advertising industry. But not only that, he thought deeply about the field of leadership, and when he was building DDB Worldwide, which became the first publicly traded network, and he really transformed the industry through that. He was just a great person, and his main guy that he admired in leadership was Lao Tzu. And the notion of the disappearing act of leadership, I think, is something that leaders don't do very well. So let me stop right there. I apologize for going over my time. I want to hear what the panel has to say. And I'll be happy to interact in any way that you